So welcome to everyone to the third HPS seminar, and today we have Charles. So
sorry, there's one broken part of the blinds here that is like exactly blinding me with sunlight. There we go.
Yeah, we have Charles with like what is a classical problem in HPS, which is how to talk about things that change over time, but I think in a philosophical way. It's a problem that we like, that's why we do HPS. So yes, please, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for being here. This is a kind of a weird talk, so we'll see how it goes. It's a bit of an amalgamation of two open projects of mine. But it does kind of point in the direction of more work that I think maybe I want to do in the future. So I'm also kind of feeling out the space in terms of future project ideas. So the first project is a book chapter for an upcoming edited volume on methodology in the history of science. And I hope my editor's not watching and doesn't see the YouTube until after I've submitted the chapter so that I can say, I need to write that. It's due at the end of the year. It's really not that long from now. So anyway, there's that. And so in that article, or that chapter, I've been tasked with thinking about what it means to use the history of science as scientific journal articles as source material for the history of science. So at that kind of theoretical level, that's sort of the first element of what's going on here. The second element is no, not the notifications. I don't want to spy on that. No, not there either. Don't go to the corners. Sorry, I'm trying to hide the mouse pointer, but I keep hiding it in the incorrect manner. There we go, right there. Don't touch it. I'll only use the space bar now. And the second project, because at the end of this you'll see there's a little bit of kind of applied stuff, because I wanted to think not just about the problems at a theoretical level, but then I also wanted to think about how do you get around the problems at a practical level with using journal articles in the history of science and HPS work. And so it's some preliminary data from, again, a project that I'm just starting now. This is one that I know that I'm going to do. Building on prior work that I've been doing about the introduction of statistical methods into the biosciences, I want to think about the analogy or the similar development in the physical sciences and what all of that has to do with hometown hero here in Belgium, the diffusion of Quetelet's statistical works into the hard sciences. So all of that's kind of mixed together in this talk in a weird way that I hope will make some degree of sense and still be illuminating. I'm going to start, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start by very briefly gesturing at actually what is now very old prior work from my first grant right after I got here. I have a lot more slides on that. If people are interested in what I brush over, I have bonus slides at the end, so feel very free to ask questions. But that considers the problem of how you can relate a question that's more interesting to philosophers of science and to historians, but how can you relate scientific journal article text and scientific practice? So a kind of classic worry, if you are sort of post-philosophy of science in practice inclined, what do journal articles do for you? Because we often think that journal articles are actually bear a kind of weird and tenuous relationship to practice. Then I'm going to get into the real history stuff. So this question about precisely what is it that journals are and have been, and historically speaking, how can we try to understand the various meanings of journal publication over there'll be a nearly 340 year scope here. That's how long we've had scientific journals. And then I'm going to get into some practical stuff at the end and try to think about how to analyze these shifts computationally. And yeah, for a 5-second take-home message, really tempting thing to want to do. I want to do it. I imagine at least some of you want to do it, to do longitudinal kind of historical studies of journals. It's a very useful thing, but it's very hard to figure out how to be sensitive to this sort of changing historical status of what that meant over time. Okay, so yeah, let me just kind of to sort of introduce the problem. Let me try to motivate that second to last thing I just said. So why would you want to do this? Like what makes journal articles fun, interesting from an HPS perspective? Well, very often in 2025, right, the scientific literature is read as being almost coextensive with the journal literature. That's practically considered to be two ways to talk about the same thing. And journal articles also have this very interesting and very attractive kind of claim to sort of completeness and stability, right? There's this idea that the scope of a journal is very nearly the scope of the disciplines that it covers, where then if you talk about generalist journals like Science and Nature, it's very nearly coextensive with the scope of the contemporary sciences. And then also, with a couple of exceptions about things like retractions, sort of, you get sort of precisely the kind of accretionary model that, Kuhn taught us to be distrustful of, but it seems to hold in the journal literature, right? Every further article sort of brings another brick to the journal literature, and we steadily construct this pile of articles. We give them fancy numbers to identify where they come from, and let us be able to track them into the future. I don't know if you knew this, but each part of the DOI has a different meaning. The prefixes pick out publishers, and then the suffixes pick out articles. We give them these kind of permanent identifiers, indicators. We throw them into these large international databases. Where this is already now out of date. Web of Science is old news. All the cool kids are using OpenAlex now. This is a commercial proprietary database. There are non-commercial open access versions of this database. Major hat tip to our friends at Utrecht who put that together. Supposedly, right, this is supposed to be a way to dive into a search interface, a sort of discovery and browsing interface, and have all of science at your fingertips. And theoretically, it lets you do stuff like this. This is actually my journal article corpus charted over time. You could start to gather text and metadata about the overall production in the sciences. And then, what starts to make this attractive from an HPSE perspective is how far the left-hand side of this graph goes. Right, so this goes back, the major kind of moments in the history of this graph are the founding of the journal Nature, which is about here. And then what you get here at the far left is the very beginnings of some of the, for the data that I have, the beginnings of some of the proceedings and transactions of the Royal Society volumes. They go back farther than that. I just don't have the older stuff. When you look at this, and I mean, of course, there are data artifact reasons that explain why after about 2000 my collection explodes. But this kind of reasonably flat trend line is actually, like I say, a very tantalizing thing to dangle in front of an HPS person, because all of a sudden here we are, and we can say to ourselves, well, gosh, surely that signal carries all kinds of interesting information about the development of the sciences from 1850 to 2000. That's a huge scope, and it's a huge scope, again, for which we maybe can even plausibly claim a little bit of completeness, if we're happy about how we constructed our corpus, and if we're happy about the quality of our inbound data. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure I realized I can't look ahead in my talk if I don't have a copy of my slides on the screen in front of me. Give me 2 seconds. I don't talk from notes, but I do want to cheat and know what's on the next slide before I hit the button. Okay, yeah. So, I already mentioned that I was going to talk about a problem that I'm not going to talk about. So let me briefly talk about a problem that I'm not going to talk about, which is this link between scientific text and scientific practice. And in some sense, this is actually a very old, well-recognized problem. It's, as I already briefly stated, the thing that made me get kind of worried about this was working on an early FNRS project after I got here and being confronted with the philosophy of science and practice literature, and in particular the critiques in that literature of sort of what it means to publish a journal article. So in the philosophy of science and practice literature, you have a lot of people who have spilled a lot of ink, being very worried, and I think very rightly very worried, about the fact that the stuff that shows up in a journal article has a real tendency to hide the interesting parts of doing science, right? That's the finished results, that's the completed answers, that's the story that you tell when you want to look respectable and presentable. It's not the record of the failures, it's not the record of the false starts, it's not the record of how you actually decided to do the experiment, how you managed to make the machine work in spite of it not working at 3 o'clock in the morning that one time. That stuff all doesn't make it into the article, and that stuff, the argument goes, is where a lot of the interesting meat of doing science is. That's what got me into it, but then I quickly discovered, and this is a pretty old worry in the history of science literature as well. A bit more recent of an article, but you've got Jim Secord here already saying that if you're thinking about the history of science in a kind of journal forward, professionalization forward way, that's going to start to sideline the forms in which knowledge appeared, assuming the publication in specialist periodicals was already established as the only legitimate means for announcing new discoveries, thus downplaying other methods such as conversation books, letters, and museum displays, right? So historians have been worried about this for a long time, too. As you look back, how should you understand the epistemic status of what goes into a scientific journal article? Like I said, I'm not going to talk about that now, mostly because that came out in a paper a long time ago with some names that I've now been here long enough that you two are the only two who will remember, which is kind of weird. I've been here for a while now. Yeah, this was me and two postdocs on that first project. So I can talk a lot more about what's in this paper. What we tried to do here is wrestle directly with that question. So what different epistemic roles can we say that scientific journal publication plays in a contemporary context now, not with the historical problem in mind? And how can we kind of analyze and unpack that with the aid of both some philosophical and sociological theories about journals, as well as work from things like corpus linguistics on how to construct generalizations on the basis of text, that kind of stuff. Like I say, can say more later, but I wasn't going to spend too much time on that end today. Today I want to get into the history stuff. So, indeed, right, the scientific journal. It's a bit of a funny creature in the sense that, superficially anyway, journals have had something vaguely resembling the same form since 1665. That's the first, I'm going to come back to that very directly, the first publication of the first scientific journal, the Journal des Savants in Paris. Again, superficially, and let me really draw a line under superficially, because it's a thing that comes out every week or so, maybe a little bit less often, but regular publication schedule, has things in it that look like articles. Each article is the responsibility of one author. Maybe we know who they are, maybe we don't. Those are supposed to present scientific discoveries, as well as a bunch of other stuff. that is supposed to be a kind of positive, permanent contribution to the record of the scientific literature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so that's, again, from a 10,000 meters view, it's kind of been the same thing since the end of the 17th century. That's a long time for a single kind of artifact to survive in the world, and if you are a historian of science or have some history of science training, your history senses should be tingling a little bit now, right? Like, we can't really have been doing the same thing in 1665 that we're doing in 2025, can we, right? And the answer is no. I mean, we can't and we weren't. But interestingly, there's actually not that much literature in HPS, broadly speaking, about this. And I discovered this from the philosophy side, writing that BJPS article that you saw the first page of a while back. And in the time since, I have discovered this from the history of science side, where essentially there are two really good authors who have thought about this. There's Melinda Baldwin and Alex Cesar, and I'm going to quote a bunch from both of them in the next half an hour, because that's who there is. This comes from Melinda Baldwin's book. Baldwin wrote a single, very fantastic book on the development, founding, creation, expansion, explosion of the journal Nature. So Nature as now, of course, well, at worst, the #2 journal in all of science. Maybe the #1 journal in all of science. Science and Nature can have a fight, which is also a UK-US fight, but anyway. Nature's founding story is really delightfully detailed in this book. Hearty recommend if you're interested in the history of scientific publication. It's super readable. It's really fun. I can't say enough good things about it. But she, from the very beginning of this book, notices this is in the introduction, page 11. She's saying, very clearly, and she has this exactly right. Historians of science have used journals as sources, right? That's how we've approached scientific journals as a category. But journals aren't only sources. Journals are also a historical phenomenon. The invention of journals, the changing roles that journals have taken in the publication or in the dissemination of scientific knowledge, that is itself a historical story. So we need to make sure that we need to figure out how to stop taking the existence of journals for granted and instead see them as objects whose existence requires explanation. So very briefly, right, the idea here is that the modern journal article is sort of a background assumption, even of a lot of what is otherwise really careful, really nuanced, very good work in HPS. We have a real tendency to think that things have always been the way they are. Alex Cesar's book, which comes out in 2018, and really is, at this point anyway, the kind of magisterial tour de force book about what it means, what scientific journals have meant over time. Does a really good job, in addition to talking about the institutional and organizational and personal and social aspects of what journal publication meant. Cesar's book does a really nice job. I don't want to call it an HPS work, but it really nearly is an HPS work. He brushes up against the epistemological consequences of what this means. And one thing that I think is very important, and then we're going to follow this into some examples so that we can kind of see what he means, is, as he argues here, that before about the early 20th, and I might even push that date farther to maybe the Second World War, journals by no means constituted a uniquely appropriate medium for announcing a new claim to discovery, and if the category, in the contemporary sense, scientific journal, existed at all, it did not correspond to our modern conception. When learned journals first emerged in the 17th century, they took after newspapers and gazettes, by design ephemeral and often in disrepute. the various editors of the Journal des Savants, which already, right, I mean, most of the people in the room know at least a little bit of French. Journal, right? It's not revue at this point. It's journal. It's like a newspaper. They referred to themselves as journalists. The editors referred to themselves as journalists. They took themselves to be recounting the sciences. They took themselves to be telling you about what's going on in the world of intellectual exchange, right? And so they often ran toward controversy in the way that muckraking yellow journalism did as well in the history of journalism. It's a very, very different intellectual role than you might have expected, even if, as we'll see here in a little bit, they often had pretty lofty goals. Yeah.
It's the editors who saw themselves as journalists, not the authors.
No, the editors, yeah. Although, at that time, almost everything was getting written by a little kind of editorial board cadre of guys who would have thought of themselves as journalists. And usually published anonymously. Or people wanted to criticize things openly and then they might sign stuff. But again, it was this kind of public critique function, really, more than anything else. Or, as we'll see a bit later on, I think I have a slide on this. If I don't, I'll talk more about it when I get there. Sort of heaping public praise there, especially in the late 17th, early 18th. Nobody wants to say anything mean about science because it's the late 17th and early 18th centuries. I mean, everything is awesome. It's a golden age, right? What are we getting? We're like talking about how cool Hooke's micrographia is. That's what we're doing, right? We're not criticizing science.
So the question is, are there differences between philosophical transactions and the Journal des Savants?
Absolutely. And I won't quite get to today. But one thing that's the, whatever it is, 50, 75 year gap. This is actually something that Cesar goes into in some detail. The 50, 75 year gap there means that already by the time you get to the Royal Society really feeling the need to open a journal, they're doing it for entirely different reasons than the French were doing it 50, 75 years earlier.
Okay.
It's playing more of a, as you probably know if you've read some of those old Royal Society papers, there's very much this idea of sort of reading something into the record that's taking place in the Royal Society. It's this kind of, nullius in verba, thing about like we have to demonstrate publicly, and then we're going to write it down to make sure that everybody knows what we did. And that's not at all this, newspaper Gazette vibe, right? So that's, even immediately you already start to see this is like, you're presaging the thing, like where I'm going, but it's exactly the kind of, these are the shifts I had in mind, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, of course, right? One problem with these ideas is that they suppose that the format and uses of journals and papers have remained more or less constant throughout their existence, but this is not true. The Philosophical Transactions itself, exemplifies this problem. Few publications have taken on as diverse a set of formats and meanings as this publication has over its long history. So yeah, I'm not going to talk about the Phil transactions today. I want to instead, I'll take my two examples from Nature and the Journal des Savants. So two radically different time periods, two radically different reading publics, but this will start to give you an idea of the kinds of problems that I'm trying to unpack here. So Nature is getting founded. We're kicking it off, and its publisher Macmillan is writing an advertisement to encourage people to come publish in the journal in 1869. And here are the goals that we have for Nature in 1869. First, to place before the general public the results of scientific work and scientific discovery, and to urge the claims of science to a more general recognition in education and daily life. So a popularization function, right? From the very beginning, the idea is this is supposed to be a thing that everybody's going to want to read. You're supposed to want to go to the newsstand and buy Nature and become edified. And this is deeply mid-19th century. This is deeply Victorian. As a matter of fact, others have argued, Jim Secort's been prominent here as well, that was in fact the role of a lot of thinking about science through the middle of the 19th century. So for example, a lot of books such as John Herschel's Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, that now we go back, we read this as a phil science text, right? We look at this book and we say, oh, it's about like, how do you do a good experiment? How do you find a cause? How do you run good observations? People at the time, they were reading that book as, boy, scientists seem to be epistemically virtuous people. How can I also myself become epistemically virtuous? It was in like the self-help aisle of the bookstore, would be another way to think about it, right? And so you've got this vibe here from Nature at the beginning. Secondly, it could aid scientific men themselves by giving early information of all advances made in any branch of natural knowledge throughout the world, and by affording them an opportunity of discussing the various scientific questions which arise from time to time. And so, right, for scientists, it's a kind of advanced warning system, and it's a sort of discussion forum. And what's very interesting is first of all, the first thing that's very interesting is you'll note that nowhere in there is anything resembling a contemporary role for publishing and obtaining credit for a novel scientific discovery, right? It's not there. The quote does not continue. It's not in there. So that's already interesting enough. And then the other thing that's interesting is to see the way over the first, and this is what Baldwin goes into in some really, really lovely detail, the way in which these different roles sort of waxed and waned over the first about 50 years of the journal's publication. The popularization aim dies almost immediately. So the editor really pushes on a bunch of top-flight 19th century scientists. Says, look, guys, come on. Write really cool articles that the general public will get the general public interested in electrical phenomena, in gravitational phenomena, in astronomy, and like all the people they write, either they just don't do it, or they come back with like deeply complicated, completely unreadable scientific contributions, right? So like that very quickly dies. He cannot get people to play along. With the publisher and the early editors cannot get people to play along with this aim. So that leaves this second round of stuff. And there's a few kind of ebbs and flows here, right? As Baldwin writes, in the 19th century, contributors began using Nature at its weekly turnaround time to debate scientific questions and to give abstracts of longer forthcoming papers in monthly or quarterly journals. So that's two fun and interesting features, right? The fact that these things were published so quickly meant that you could fight in them very effectively, and you could fight in public. And there weren't that many ways to fight in public yet in the 19th century, right? As anybody knows who's read some correspondence of scientists in the 19th, they're fighting in private all the time. The ability of a 19th century scientist to write letters to his friends is something that I I swear to God, I have been in correspondence archives where I think a single guy wrote 10 or 15 letters in an afternoon, longhand with a pen, and then mailed them all. And I can barely write that many emails, and I type really fast. So they were fighting in private constantly. But airing these disagreements in public, it turns out, was something that the scientific community really had a desperate need for. So that got really popular really fast. It also here starts to take on the priority function, right? if you knew you had a cool paper that was going to come out in some future edition of, say, something like the Philosophical Transactions, or one of your various quarterly reviews, monthly or quarterly reviews, you could warn everybody that it was coming. And you could write a couple of paragraphs and tell everybody that it was coming down the pipeline. And so it's not until the early 20th century that you get novel discoveries, but you still don't even get like full novel discoveries, right? You don't get full scientific journal articles in the modern sense. By the early 20th, what you start to get is, okay, I'm going to give you a preview of my new discovery, and then you can wait on the full paper. You know, that'll give me time to write the full paper. Then it really does become sort of a priority certification method. And so it takes even longer then for that to turn over and for people to decide, okay, well, if I'm writing that up, I may as well send the entirety of the observation onto the journal from the very beginning. Let's rewind the clock, because I think it's a really fun comparison to think about the relationship between this, which feels a bit more familiar, and the environment around the founding of the Journal des Savants, which it feels much less familiar. So here we are, 1665, volume 1, issue 1. Salo, who's the first editor of the journal, kicks it off anonymously with a letter from the printer to the reader. He's enumerating, and I'm actually going to come back to the full list, so I'm starting with the third thing, because the third thing is science. I'll come back to the full list of things in a second. But the third thing that he's telling his readership that this journal is going to be about is it's going to be about telling you about experiments in physics and chemistry that could serve to explain the effects of nature. The new discoveries made in the arts and in the sciences, like machines and useful or curious inventions that mathematicians might give us. Observations of the heavens, of meteors, and what anatomy might tell us of new stuff about animals. There actually was a furious debate for the following few decades about animal souls that was centered around small, angry, back and forth journal articles. So it was actually kind of, how to put it, a good guess on the part of the editor there. So, okay, actually, like, reads kind of surprisingly contemporarily, believe it or not, for 1665, right? Setting aside what I was describing yesterday as I was running through these sources, it seems that late 17th century French was a vibes-based spelling enterprise. There weren't rules. You just kind of went for how it sounded in your soul, and then you wrote it down. But other than that, it reads pretty modern. We're going to present our new discoveries. We're going to present observations from all the different branches of the sciences. But what makes this journal so interesting, in addition to the fact, well, I'll come back to things about content and form, which this might make you think of a much more modern idea of content and form, which would be completely wrong. So I'll come back to that in a second. But first, let's talk about scope. So that was the third thing. There are 5 things. The 5 things are, first, a sort of global public bibliography of all the cool stuff that's going to get printed right now. Elogies of famous dead people, stuff about the sciences, court decisions, and everything cool that a smart person might want to know. Very interesting, right? And now you're starting to get a bit more the newspaper vibe, right? This gives real sort of weekly newspaper for people with college degrees kind of energy, right? And that I think is already really interesting, because what we start to see here is a tiny bit about this in Caesar and Baldwin, but the one really good thing to have ever been written about the early period of the history of this journal is a 1928 University of Paris doctoral thesis written by a woman who was actually Welsh, and I don't know how her French is this good, in 1928, and or in 1928, how a Welsh woman talked her way into the PhD program at the University of Paris. I now totally want to know everything about this woman's biography. She sounds awesome. But her dissertation is the first sort of 4 editors of this journal. What did they do and how did they do it, and what was going on in the journal and how was it written? So we don't have a very, and it was 1928, so I mean the philosophy of science caliber of the treatment is not exactly spectacular. She's clearly coming from a literary perspective. She's seeing the development of this journal, in fact, only secondarily as a contribution to the dissemination and construction of scientific knowledge, and primarily as a contribution to the construction of public literary critique, which is very interesting. I think what did it mean at the end of the 17th century that we were going to start doing literary critique in public, a thing that we had not really done before. And actually what it meant is a lot of angry letters and lawsuits. The journal is shut down for a few months by the Jesuits because they got into the Jansenism fight, and it was a whole thing. Be that as it may or may not be that, let's see if we can kind of extract some lessons for the dissemination of scientific knowledge here. First of all, let me disabuse you of the idea about format here. The articles were tiny, sometimes just a few lines. It was rare that they took up more than 2 pages. So right off, you're talking about, again, a very kind of gazetteer, newspapery, journalistic kind of structure. And so a very different form of critique, a very different form of transmission of knowledge. And something that I didn't talk about in the case of Nature, but something that was true from 1665, again, straight on through till about the Second World War, is that the role of the editor is enormous. Here, she says even more than today, well, in 1928, I'm actually not sure that that's the case, but the success of a journal depended on the personality of its editor. Neither the fortitude of Sallow nor the negligence of Galois, the second editor, was way busier flitting around the Royal Academies in Paris than he was actually bothering to edit the journal, and so it only had like 1 number in an entire year for a while. Couldn't dull the interest of the educated world in this new form of critique and communication. And so the impact of individual personality is another thing that you're going to have to figure out how to disentangle if you want to go back and study this stuff. And I've actually watched this firsthand. I ran with a team in Canada an analysis of a broad scope journal in statistics that dated from 1901 to the present. Actually, we did 120 years worth of longitudinal analysis of this journal. And actually, the very first thing that happens is before 1960, what you see is the 30 years that it was edited by its first editor, and then the 25 years it was edited by its second editor. And those papers all look much more similar to each other than to anything else that goes on in the journal. So it's almost like you're talking about 3 journals at that point. You've got such a strong imprint of the editorial influence of the editor-in-chief that it's actually really interesting to think about what it means from an HPS perspective to sort of pull that thread out. Long story short, I think there's a real interesting challenge here, right? Whatever kinds of readings we're doing, even if you're close reading this stuff, even if you're going to go sit in the KBR and read an original copy of the Journal des Savants from 1665, You've got to figure out how to make that reading sensitive to these shifts in use, meaning, and then social, institutional, editorial, political context, right? And it's very tempting to think that you don't have to do that, but I think what I'm trying to show here is sort of bludgeon you with examples of why you're not going to be able to get away with that. And then say, I don't think this is a problem that we've really sort of, how to put it? I don't want to say not taken seriously, but because that implies that we took it unseriously. I think it's just sort of been a blind spot in the utilization of journal articles as a source. I think people often pretty uncritically cite journal work from, the late 19th, the early 20th, without or earlier, without really trying to wrestle with this problem. Perfect. I've got 20 minutes left, so let me kind of run over some of these ways out. What can we do then? And so now I'm going to kind of put my digital humanities hat on, because that's obviously one of my hats. And I want to think about how, if you want to do digital stuff, and you want to do digital stuff with that whole corpus of articles that starts in 1850, and you want to say something smart about the development of science over time, how could you not make this mistake? What does it mean to not make this mistake? How can you try to get out from under this confusing situation? The first thing that I'm going to talk about fairly extensively, I'll kind of sketch up an example of what it might mean to do this, is to sort of start by putting that question out front and trying to think about, okay, maybe that means that the first thing we need to do, before we even look at content, we need to look at form. Before we even look at theoretical, semantic meaning, we need to look at what kind of thing are we dealing with. And then at the very end, I'm gonna gesticulate really wildly about these last 2 points, but I'll come back to wild gesticulation in a second. So yeah, here's another point where Cesar sort of brushes up against this epistemic consequence he doesn't really go farther in this claim, but this is sort of the claim that I want to figure out how to unpack as an HPS person, right? Journals make this shift from being purveyors of scientific news to archives of discovery. And what's really interesting is that has pretty direct consequences for our understanding of the epistemic structure of the scientific enterprise, right? When you do that, it becomes, again, as I already said, journal articles seem to have this kind of Lego structure. Journal articles seem to have this accretionary, accumulative kind of vibe. Exactly the thing that, Kuhn shouted at us to not take seriously. Whatever you think of the overall merits of his shouting or not, I tend to think he's right. Other people disagree with me. We can have that argument later over beer. But it seems, I think Cesar has it exactly right that the journal literature as an epistemic object led us, in part, to conceive of science as a series of discrete discovery events localized in time and connected with an individual author, right? And that all of a sudden it tends to hide a bunch of really tricky questions about collective knowledge. It tends to hide a bunch of really tricky questions about social epistemology, about organizational and institutional structures, about transmissions of knowledge, who read what and when. Of course, the fact that something was published at a particular location, in a particular journal, at a particular time does not mean that the entire scientific community immediately became aware of its existence, right? All these kinds of questions can start to get shoved to the outside. So what could we maybe do? What could we maybe do to not do that? And so the first thing that I want to try to think about how to take seriously is the fact that the type of propositional content in articles seems to have been different, right? Some of these are claims to new discoveries, but without really an explanation of what the discovery is, right? Some of these articles might have theoretically, the complete argumentative justification for a scientific knowledge claim. And we could really, put on our old positives hat, right? We could say you do get the kind of clean context of justification story sometimes in some journal articles at some periods of time in some kinds of journals. You also get summaries of other stuff. You also get letters that are debates among scientists. Then you get the weird stuff, right? Which, if you've ever spent some time really like sitting with a folder that contains the PDFs of all the articles in some journal, you realize it's like a whole lot of what actually gets printed is weird crap like editorials and obituaries and prize notices and some lecture that some guy gave somewhere sometime that for some reason the journal decided they were willing to print, and et cetera, right? There's this giant sort of miscellanea bucket that you have to figure out how you're going to deal with. So what I want to do is see maybe if we could do that kind of within a kind of classification first way. So I wanted to hunt for a case study that's manageable in size, that's messy and ugly, and that I know enough about that I can go analyze the details by hand. And so as I already foreshadowed, that's going to be Ketley. But what I want to do is I want to look at who was talking about him, or what was he saying in Nature before 1900. One thing that I think is very interesting is, as I briefly gestured at as well, the ways in which statistics stops becoming a social science and starts becoming a hard science, or starts becoming a tool that's adopted by the hard sciences to answer hard science problems. And as it turns out, there's a bunch of them, which is cool. So that's one. There's never none in any given year. And especially, of course, he dies in there. So that's kind of reasonable. But while he's alive, and especially while he's alive and working on building the Royal Academy of Belgium and the Royal Observatory of Belgium, both of which he was very instrumental in, in the former case, not the construction of the Academy is much older than him, but the Academy became much more serious under him. And in the second case, the observatory did not exist before him. He literally did found the observatory in the lovely old building that's now in Rue Ketley. That houses home grade now in downtown Brussels, just off the ring. The people who will come evaluate your house's energy usage. They work out of Ketley's observatory building. Love Brussels. So he was a popular guy for the period while he was doing all of this very intense institutional work. I'm going to foreshadow real quick and say, so the first thing I did is I just kind of manually coded these because these are just a small enough data set that I could just sit and read these and try to figure out, okay, so why are we talking about him? Why does his name come up? Why does he get mentioned at all? And then I want to see if I can kind of reproduce something that looks like this in a more automated way so that I could do it over a lot more kinds of articles. Unsurprisingly, a quarter of them are in what I'm going to call society business type reports. So one thing that Nature very regularly did is it reported on what all the learned societies of Europe were up to, including ours. And so it very regularly would say, oh yes, whatever paper was, presented in the absence of its author at the Royal Academy in Brussels by Mr. Ketley. Cool, society kind of business. Meteorology, so for those of you who don't know, this is one of the things that parts of Ketley's career that's a bit less well known, I find. He led a massive, nigh global effort to standardize the collection of meteorological data, including the construction of a kind of standard meteorological observation point that was going to be reproduced by a bunch of different navies, including while they all went around and did colonialism. And so that was a big part of his thing. Astronomy, obviously, here's the observatory, as well as his extensive work on making astronomical observations. A little bit in pure statistics, a little bit about his books, and then interestingly, well, now with my with my historian of biology hat on, a nice chunk in life and human sciences. Many of which really are life sciences. I mean, this isn't just talking about demographics. So you can already see why this would be a challenge to analyze, right? These society business notes are super weird. They're these weird little short summaries. Again, they're kind of newspapery, they're pretty bizarre. Book notices, obviously, book reviews, even today in journals, are kind of weird, right? You get this weird interaction sometimes between the person who writes the thing and the content of the book that they're talking about, right? It's a standard problem. We all are aware of it. So maybe we could do some of this kind of thing in advance, right? Is there something we could do to kind of sort these articles before we look at them and use that to peel apart the kind of semantic content in a way that could maybe then tell us how and why were people thinking about Kedley, in what context, with what kinds of meanings, especially if, as I would like to do, I want to analyze more than just nature, so I'm not just going to have 106 data points, I might have a few thousand data points. I mean, yes, 106 data points, I could just read all these, I'm aware of that. But if it blows up, right, what could I do? So what I tried to do was run a sort of automated classifier. It might separate normal scientific articles from book and paper notices from notes, which were things like notes from the editor, et cetera, small journalistic notes, from society business. Is there some way we can kind of do this sorting ahead of time so that then I can analyze each of those categories separately? It's okay. The way that the classifier wound up working, the proper scientific articles were sort of the leftovers pile. So what I tried to have it do was pull out the really weird stuff that seemed to me to be the course of action the most likely to succeed. So let's build something that can detect the society business pieces, the notes pieces, and the book and article review pieces, and set those aside, so that maybe the signal will become a little bit clearer. And it worked all right. The book and article notices classifier got a lot of papers whose title was book reviews. I mean, I'm okay with that. And Our Bookshelf, which was I like that, and that was the title of the book review column for a while. It does also get societies and academies and notes pretty frequently, which is bad. Those are supposed to go into other categories, right? So this is okay. Notes, well, the first thing it gets is societies and academies, which again is bad. That really should be in the other category with the societies and academies stuff. But it does also catch like this university and education column, geographical notes. You know, these are the kinds of things that need to be caught. Society business, it did okay. It did catch a lot of the societies and academies stuff, although it does get a bit confused by some of these other kinds of notes. You know, not great, not awful. A long way from being perfect. I did not really find, I didn't take an extensive amount of time to sort of fine-tune some kind of model to really get into the details here. I did a very basic kind of pre-trained classifier against this stuff. But long story short, I do think this is promising. I do think that an interesting way forward here is to start by having the type of document guide you, right? To start by clustering out the kinds of thing you have in your corpus, and then figuring out as the researcher what's the appropriate analysis to be brought to bear in each of those classes. I said I would furiously gesture at this, so let me furiously gesture. So one thing that is very interesting, there is a bit of work applied to what are often called now multimodal analyses. So what's a multimodal analysis? Well, multimodal analysis is what you get if you try simultaneously to analyze things like author networks or citation networks or collaboration networks and text. That's the multiple modes, right? The idea is there's a few people, UCLouvain from the Netherlands was really the person who was doing this, and unfortunately he died. So we'll have to see what happens with that. It was a very young research project, and he was a kind of domineering lab head, so I don't know how it's going to go with what's picked up with that afterward. The one thing that might be interesting is you might think about using those same kinds of tools, because obviously the point of a multimodal analysis is that these different modes are very different. You want to build algorithms for analyzing their content where they're treated as very different kinds of thing. Well, that's exactly what we were just doing, right? We were thinking about how to do an analysis where the source data is composed of really heterogeneous types of content. So it's weird to call it multimodal because it's all just text, right? But maybe there is some way to do something that looks kind of like a multimodal analysis that only looks at the sort of very heterogeneous content of a wide scope journal analysis. And at the end, I mean, partly this last point is left over from me thinking about this in concert with some digital humanists. But I do think this also poses a really interesting question if we want to do these large-scale, broad-scope analyses. How do we balance that? How do we balance using digital tools, using these analytic methods that actually might let us look at the whole darn thing at once? How do we balance that with close reading? I mean, we know we're going to have to close read. Obviously, one of the things that's very important that all these examples today have shown us is that close reading is how you understand that there are different kinds of things in your journal. Close reading is how you understand what those different kinds of things are. It's how you start to unpack the motivations of the people who are writing. It's how you start to unpack the motivations of the editors. This is all stuff that you've got to do the old-fashioned way. This is all old-fashioned history of science. That somehow has got to get balanced with the fact that if you want to talk about 150 or 200 or 350 years of scientific change, you can't close read it all. It's physically impossible. So you're going to have to think about how to put these tools in dialogue. And this is a way, I mean, obviously it's always the case that you have to do close reading when it goes with your, to go with your digital work. This is something that I always talk about. But I think what makes this case a little different is the problem becomes acute in a way that I think you're not just doing close reading to make sure that the computer's figured out things correctly. You're not just doing close reading to confirm results. You're not just doing close reading to sort of make yourself have a better intuition about the case. You need to be doing close reading as a kind of very important ingredient in the analytic process. And that is something that I at least haven't really theorized well. I haven't thought about how exactly I'm going to do that and what that's going to look like and how to turn that into like a sustainable research methodology that I could do for a big project and actually get results instead of just be stuck reading hundreds of journal articles. And that's it. So thanks. We take 5?
Yeah, let's take 5 and
I really want one, and I just haven't figured out who will make me one yet. Of course, it's the old SNCB font that they've discontinued now. They're slowly taking those signs out of all the old stations, and it makes me sad.
Oh, I didn't see the connection with.
It's the old SNCB
I
font.
see.
Etterbeek still has one.
I
There are a
think
few.
in Montigny, on this old ways from which the trains which go to Leuven usually go from, I think there you can find some, but I'm sure.
In the old font.
Yeah.
I love the old
So at
font.
some point you want your own station.
That's it.
And
It's just a stop. People come for a while and they leave.
Shubi?
Yeah, questions. Fire away. I can field my own. Obviously, it's small. We can be low key.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting and important, it seems to me. But you focus a lot on, obviously, on things that have to do with how we do statistics about the history of science, it seems. And so the issues you have seem to be solvable all by close reading, because then we see what kind of paper it is, and so on. While I was wondering whether if this activity of publishing has changed so much over time, whether there are not issues that we can't even solve by reading the thing, because we have to actually know what the authors were aiming at. Now we publish to like get a good application file and get a job and so
Yeah,
on.
good.
They had other kind of intentions with it, and
Good.
if they have other intentions, then maybe the meaning of what they say changes, and that's things you cannot just even discover when you see that it's actually something that looks like what we could call today an article. It still seems like an article, but basically they were not trying to make sure that they get a living for the rest of their career.
Yeah.
While we are, and so you see what I'm getting at?
You know what I think part of what you just did is, and this is really helpful to me, I think you just expressed really nicely the worry that I was trying to grope at in that last point there. Right? That it's just, we're not just close reading because we, need to make sure that we understand what the words meant. Right? Sometimes if I'm looking for a first order claim about the history of biology, sometimes I do need to be worried about just like, oh, well, what did they, when they said inheritance, what the heck did that mean in 1894? But here you're right. It's that's part of this issue that I'm worried about, is that it seems to go deeper than that. It's not just that I don't know what the first order meaning is. And this gets at some of the stuff that I tried to wrestle with in that BJPS paper. Because even in the contemporary context, right, I consider, so we looked through the literature about exactly this question about like, what are you doing when you write an article? And we pulled out, at least there are 3 pretty well fleshed out theories. There's a great kind of arch post-positivist paper that's just like, it's pure context of justification, bro. There's a great, there's obviously your kind of Latourian angle where you can say like, look, it's a power game, I'm just trying to win converts. And then Joe Rouse has some cool stuff where he argues it's this kind of narrative construction thing that we're doing. You're trying to sort of write yourself into the story of your field.
Who is that story?
Rouse, R-O-U-S-E, Joseph. And that's really cool stuff. But you're exactly right. I even, how to put it, the process of writing that paper almost started to make me worried about this stuff even at the contemporary level. And I really don't know what to do with that worry. In some sense, the least satisfying part of that paper is the conclusion, because the conclusion of that paper is basically, you should probably think about this stuff before you have a real opinion about what journal articles are up to. And in some sense, that's obviously that's true, but that's like not real illuminating. It was good enough to convince BJPS, and I think the questions are really interesting. I haven't answered that. I haven't answered that question for myself. The one thing I can say is, brutal though this is, it has started to make me think that if you really rely on close reading in a particular context of a particular author at a particular moment, what have you, you ought to even think about doing at least some degree of biographical reconstruction, because at least that could help a little. It's not going to just solve your problem, but at least it's an ingredient, and it's an ingredient that usually you have a little bit of access to. But beyond that, and I mean that's a kind of self-evident claim. Beyond that, I don't have a lot to say about it, which is part of why I am. That's one of the things that motivates me being worried about this, and this kind of keeping me up at night.
Follow up. One of the things that is anyway frustrating me a lot, and that came up kind of in the talk, is the notion of vulgarization. And so I'm trying to learn a bit about physics, and I wanna do the proper stuff. But of course, there's a lot of vulgarization even by important people. And if you're already on the inside, you see that this is not their serious work. But then there's all kind of stuff that is in between or something. And seeing that those journals maybe had wanted to be partially vulgarizing scientific work, if successful or not, might mean, and the fact that there were no other means of publishing vulgarization of science may mean that a lot of early papers that came out were not even intended to be serious academic work, and were actually full of sloppy
good
blah blah blah, typical kind of thing that you do when you're vulgarizing.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. I haven't really thought about that, but it's an excellent point. The two places I would go to think more about it, well, one kind of practically speaking, and then one theoretically speaking. I have for a long time been really interested, and this gets right at your worry. I have for a long time been really interested, and I just haven't been able to execute on any project that would use this kind of analysis. But in looking at journals like Scientific American that keep that angle, right? They don't let it go, and it is supposed to be readable, and it is a magazine, and people do buy it. That I think would be really fun as a kind of comparison class. And I've had a couple, like I say, I've had a couple of projects where I've thought to myself, okay, I'm going to do the analysis over here, and then I'm going to follow it up in Scientific American and kind of see what I can track. But I just haven't ever been able to carry it through. Theoretically, there is one name, at least late 19th, early 20th, 19th and early 20th century. Peter Bowler has written fantastic stuff about the history of science popularization, including his most recent book. He's super senior. I met him for the first time not that long ago. I actually wasn't sure. When I met him, I was not sure at the time that he was still alive. And he's still cranking out books like an absolute machine. And his most recent book is supposed to be a real tour de force about sort of what it meant to popularize science, which was, in general, right, the vehicle through the late 19th and early 20th, even through the mid-century, the vehicle was books, right? You write cool pop books. But it does get very interesting, you know, it does get very interesting when you turn a little bit farther forward than that and you start to look at people like Gould, right? Or people who were, you know, essayists who popularized. And then Gould, you know, that Gould's a good example to underline exactly the difficulty of the problem that you pose. Because here's Gould writing a weekly popular science column, and like, yeah, but a bunch of those popular science columns are cited by real scientists, like now. They did real work, and sometimes he said what he meant more clearly in the pop version than in the journal article that may or may not have ever even been published that was behind it. And
it's
that
probably still the case that people are more open about their less like sophisticated views in that sort of.
Slow down and make yourself be a little more pedagogical. It helps. It even helps your fellow elite colleagues. It just helps. It just makes it better. But yeah, Bowler's histories on that. I really want to read that most recent book. I've read an older book of his about popularization in the Victorian era. It's really good as well. But yeah, that's a history that I also ought to know more about than I do.
But there was a time when that popularization was published in proper scientific journals.
At least things that, how to put it, at least in venues that were also widely read by professionals.
And the kind of classifiers you have, you want to filter those out.
Yeah, well, or at least it'd be interesting. So yeah, in nature, like I say, in nature, I don't think that's an issue. But in a broader analysis, you're right. You would have to try to think about what you wanted to do with that. Would you just want to consider them to be research pieces, or would you want to try to classify them away? And that would probably be really hard, because their semantic signature is going to be much weaker.
Yeah.
That would be really tough. That's a really hard question that I need to think about. Another good example of that kind of how to put it, gray area, Encyclopedia Britannica, which all the way through the 19th and early 20th is chock full of really top tier articles by very important people who you have heard of. You know, Boltzmann writes the entry for the word model. That's a great that's a great Hopos text, right? That's a phenomenal Hopos text. It is literally the Encyclopedia Britannica article from like 1909, and you're like, oh my god. So yeah, that kind of like talk about the definition of like, is it popular? Is it real? Does that question even make sense anymore?
Yeah. He writes it for which audience?
I mean, he's Boltzmann, so he's not like the greatest writer in the world, but I think he's intending to write for a popular audience.
It's popularization.
Yeah, but it's you know, content-wise, like it's no less heavy-hitting than anything that he was writing in his real books, right? I mean, it's got.
Try to manage.
Or at least, I mean, I guess that's the question. The question is like, is you know, what is it that makes something popular is popularized, right? In the sense that, like, if the language is a bit more readable, say, but what you're getting is still a complete recounting of his opinion, of his like fully refined professional opinion about scientific modeling. You know, I mean, is it really popularized at that point? Like, I kind of don't, like, I don't even know, right? I mean, that's
there's no demarcation.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's Caesar's point, that sort of the professionalization of science goes hand in hand with the making of the scientific journal.
Yeah.
And I think it's not by chance that Nature in 86, 82, they talk about men of science. They're not talking about scientists because.
Oh yeah. 69 even.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Word hasn't been invented yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, my question was precisely about Encyclopedia Britannica. And I was just also thinking that, so in a sense, I think it's even today relevant that sort of this popularization boost is where scientists get unhinged, and there you can see what their sort of methodological or philosophical thinking.
Yeah, good.
And I was thinking sort of if we're interested from HPS perspective, sometimes we're interested more Hopo's perspective. We're interested in this kind of question, then it's actually it's a better source maybe than more formalized and journal article.
Yeah, great.
Because precisely of this example of Boltzmann's article, because I think it's a very good read and it's
It's super interesting. Yeah, I just reprinted it in the anthology that I did for 19th century Hopos with Rowledge. So, yeah, no, absolutely, and I have even, gosh, I'm struggling now. There's something that I know that I read, and I'm trying to get back to it in my head. Yeah, who was that? That was one of Michael Ruse's claims. Ruse claimed, I believe, I have to confirm this in my notes. Ruse was claiming at one point that you catch all the biologists of the modern synthesis doing this. So when they all write pop sci books. Almost all those guys have at least one kind of big, splashy general audience book. And in those books, you catch them expressing their like weird philosophical commitments. So commitments in Ruse's case, the thing he was interested in, it's Ruse's book about the concept of progress. And so you catch them waxing lyrical about scientific progress and like human progress in a way that they refused to do. They wanted to present, Ruse claims actively, that's a subject of debate, but they wanted to present a more clean, sanitized, professional version of their scientific commitments in their journal articles. But you catch their real beliefs in their pop books.
And that's, Ruse, you cite this in your article?
Yeah, I cite this in my progress article. Yeah. I was struggling to remember who it was that made that claim, but that's Ruse's point, is that you catch them letting themselves go in their books. Which is cool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it's a bit following Peter's remark that, of course, close reading might even not be enough to solve some of the worries, and in a way, sort of this question, the third question is a classic sort of digital humanities question of like, how do we balance that and what comes first? You seem to say that you should first work on something relatively small that you know well, like Quetelet, and then sort of train your algorithm to do the more big science stuff.
I'm a big fan of that direction. Yes.
And it seems, and so my question is also that historiography there also, and knowing the historiography on specific themes also seems very important, because of the historians that don't do digital stuff, the sort of debates are happening more at the historiographical level, right? If, for example, the issue of inheritance, if you go take the notion of inheritance in early 20th century, knowing the historiography of science is going to help, the historiography of public health or medicine, and sort of it is those sort of grand narratives, or sort of the work of not just sort of trusting close reading, but trusting the close reading of several historians on specific themes that helps analyze particular text. And so
really nice,
it feels like also your readings of Quetelet were not only helped by close reading, but by having a degree of understanding of historiography of Belgium science at that particular time.
Yeah.
And so it feels like it's not just close reading versus digital stuff, but that there are sort of historiography of long histories can help sort of bridge a bit those sort of.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot, and that's something that thanks a lot. That's something that I need to think about integrating more directly in this book chapter that I'm working on, because that's a level of grain that is, I think, important. It kind of fills a gap in the sort of hierarchy of grains, and I think that that's really nice and extremely helpful. Well, again, this is a thing that I think also. HPSers have a how to put it? I want to say difficult relationship. I don't know how exactly to phrase this, but like uptake of historiography in HPS, right? Always a problem. Always a big and interesting problem. And I have distinct memories. I can remember at various points in my training, having done everything from doing HPS through a period without reading any historiography to doing HPS through the Scientific Revolution and reading that one 300-page book that's nothing but historiography, right? So I've done both of I've done both of those things and everything in between, and how to kind of explicitly, overtly, and thoughtfully take up the historiographic tradition, even though you have to be, obviously, while being careful, because we then ourselves are not necessarily trying to write histories of science, and so the first order historiographic debates don't necessarily matter to us in HPS, but they do matter anyway for exactly the reasons that you're mentioning. And so it's a very subtle, you're sort of taking, sometimes it seems like we're reading historiography and we're using it for purposes for which it was not necessarily intended, which doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it probably does mean that we need to be at least a little bit cautious about how we do it. And I don't have a very well worked out feeling for that yet. But it's a really important question. It's a really important question. Because obviously you're exactly right. You're exactly right that my orientation to Kedley is absolutely based on reading, well, in addition to a very lovely recently published biography. Author is now a friend. More broad kind of understandings of what did it mean at that period to be doing science in Belgium, and how was it related to science in France, and what did scientific transmission look like at the time, and all these kinds of questions. That's bread and butter historiographic words. That's really helpful. Thanks.
And then just one comment. I'm happy to see Baldwin and Caesar, because I read a lot for my master thesis. I did my master thesis on nature, but specifically on the ads of the advertisements in nature.
I remember this. You were telling me about this.
And actually, the reason why I found those, because and I think it relates to something that you said, that sort of first we should look at the form before looking at the content. And for me, it was, I started with the material of the, because I couldn't go to the archives because it was COVID, so I only was able to have nature as sort of as what it was in the library of my university. And it was when I realized that there were actually a lot of ads in nature that in the digitalized version you don't find them.
That's cool.
And so I was like, oh, no one really wrote about this. Baldwin, I think she writes a bit about ads,
but not much.
No.
It's one of those things that goes into that miscellaneous bucket that we then try to kind of not think about much.
And for I guess different reasons, they are not digitalized.
Right.
In the digital versions of nature. And there's also a lot of ads that merge into articles talking about the new sort of technology that they are presenting. So also there's a lot of sort of blurred lines between an actual commercial ad,
product placement,
and sort of it's like, oh, this new cool thing lets you do things in this different way, or we tried this. and there's that blurred line, and it was thanks to being able to touch the physical stuff that I was able to find it, because then in the digitized version there's already a process.
Yeah, that I have come to appreciate the material. I mean, the material culture aspect here, I think, is very serious. Well, for example, another wrinkle on the same idea. So another part of Secord's argument that we've misinterpreted things like Herschel's book is he says, have any of you ever actually gone and seen a first edition copy of Herschel's book? It's like yay big and it's printed on crappy paper. It was a general public thing, right? It wasn't a fancy science treatise. It wasn't a fancy philosophy treatise. It's crunchy acidified cheap paper, and it's like a pocket format. And I think the same thing as you're looking back, especially as you're getting back into the history of some of these journals. It's not for nothing. Yeah, early Nature is, I think is it even 4-columned? It's printed like a newspaper. And that's not for nothing. And so yeah, trying to wrestle with and again here, I mean, you also have another kind of historical inaccessibility problem, which is probably in 1869 I can get an idea of what that materiality might have meant to the person who picked the thing up off the newsstand, but I'm much less confident that I can get a feel for what the printed form of the Journal des Savants in 1669 would have meant to the person who picked it up. Yeah. That's really hard. We got some big time historical distance there that I'm not sure that I know how to bridge. But still, yeah. The point is I think very well taken. The physical form also sends a lot of messages. And yeah, it's what makes nature really feel like, I mean, until very, very recently, I don't know exactly when, I'm sure this is in Baldwin, but I can't remember the precise discussion of it. It is referred to as Nature magazine until real recently. I mean, now I think it's more known as the journal Nature. But it feels like a glossy mag in the 70s, right? It feels like a gloss. It feels like a, whatever. It's next to, Time magazine and whatever, Popular Mechanics and, these other, it's got ads and it's shiny and it's, science. I remember, when I was a kid, my dentist had a subscription to Science.
Oh, wow.
Right? Because it looks cool in your dentist's office to have a copy of Science, around. I was from a small town in Texas, right? But it was yeah, look at this is the cutting edge, here we are. So it was supposed to kind of radiate that vibe. And that, that's a thing that's another thing that I think is hard to integrate into your kind of perspective on these things. Yeah, when?
Yeah, I have a very random question. Yeah, if I understand correctly, seems the digital analysis more like linguistic analysis. Yeah, because the scientific articles is a kind of linguistic document. We analysis these papers like analysis of language. So in philosophy of science, in the positivism, there is a kind of theory about the language and the word truth. Yeah. Yes. So good. I think in your digital approach, more close to the empirical philosophy. So I may be wondering, do you have any meta level philosophy theory of language to support your idea about the knowledge, language, truth, and the word, such things in philosophy of language.
You set up. You set up one of my. You set up some of my bonus slides. So one thing that we think about in that paper, right, which I think is a cool connection that we don't pursue enough as philosophers, and we even thought about trying to run a project on this with Alexandra and Peter and a linguist, and to kind of see what these tools might mean for philosophy-style questions. Well, she was already too busy then, and now she's the dean, so now she's definitely too busy. Maybe after she's done being dean, we can finally hook Elizabeth. I don't know. We'll try. We should try again because she was interested. But what I don't think we talk enough about, especially and in particular, I mean linguistics in general, and even into connections in philosophy of language, but very specifically in this context, corpus linguists. Corpus linguists spend a lot of time thinking about, you have something that feels like a self-contained corpus of text. What is it? What does meaning mean in a corpus? How does it relate to the world? And it's fun because it's a slightly different angle on those questions than what you normally get in philosophy of language, because it's less, well, you take, linguists put the sort of individual epistemic subject way in the background, usually. Like, it's back there somewhere. But a linguist is usually less worried with, like, what is the propositional content of the brain of Steve, some particular human. We wrestled with some of this literature, and it's hard, and I don't know it well. The best results of my wrestling are in that BJPS article. It's hard stuff to read if you're not trained in it, and I am not trained in it. But what we did at least do is we tried to distinguish these two kind of big main traditions in corpus linguistics. There is a kind of more social end of the field and a more cognitive end of the field. And in the social end, you have very much this kind of, the discourse is an autonomous social object, right? And meaning is sort of a closed game that happens inside a discourse. And so meaning is about, what's meaning? Meaning is about tracing patterns of use back through the discourse. And that's kind of it. Like, forget the world. Like, you don't need the world. You can live in the discourse. That's obviously really attractive for digital analysis because we don't have to go to the world. We can stay in, it's easy for the computer to stay in the discourse. So that's nice, but it's weird to lose the link to the world, right? And then you've got a more cognitive science inflected end of linguistics that talks about entrenchment of concepts and patterns of language use as a kind of developmental, very cogsci kind of thing. Useful and interesting, harder to apply analytically, except insofar as there is a real hypothesis testing angle. Cognitive linguists seem to have a very strong idea of what they're doing as proposing and testing hypotheses about what should appear in the corpus given certain hypotheses about grammatical acceptability or entrenchment or what have you, which is that could be a useful technique. And then I kind of stopped because I was just like, look, I'm going to wind up having to get a master's degree if I don't put down this literature, and I really don't need another diploma. I would love to work more with more people who do this kind of stuff and try to figure out what it might mean for the kind of stuff that I do. And as it turns out, across the quad, there is actually an absolutely phenomenal corpus linguistics unit. Like, one of the best corpus linguistics units in Europe is right over there. But I haven't kind of been able to work my way into their thing yet, because, well, the purposes for which they use corpora are very, very different. Like, they want to build corpora to understand, you know, how do real world people actually speak Dutch? And I'm like, you know, good question. Like, I would love to, you know, that's a valid research subject, but like, not really where my head is at, you know, and so it's been hard to figure out how to build a dialogue with those people. But I think it's a really useful, it should be more precise. I harbor a hypothesis that it would be a really fruitful collaboration if I could ever find the right person and like get it off the ground. So I completely agree with you. I want to know more about it, and I haven't figured out how to know more about it yet.
Thank you.
At the end of this sort of spectrum, I was thinking a lot, but I don't know how to phrase this question, but I think you helped me think of like the relationship between the language and the world. At the end of the spectrum would be economic historians, which take historical statistics on, let's say, charcoal production, and then they sort of do regression analysis of historical CO2 emissions, as if, like, so there's no discourse here. It's just like the historical tables of the Ministry of Industry applied directly to CO2 emissions, as if they were the real thing, and it just feels like very hard to interact with them, especially me going from history of science, where it is a lot about the discourse and not so much about for us CO2 in the 19th century in global warming didn't exist. But for them, they very much existed, and it's quantifiable.
I thought you were a Marxist.
Yeah, but this, for me, this level, it feels very uncomfortable for me to go to that. But yeah.
No, I mean, I have a similar thing. That sounds a bit to me like the interactions that I have had. My version of that kind of odd interactions with the very hardcore scientometrics people, whom I, you know, just like, well, we're sort of doing the same thing. That is to say, I want to understand broad trends in scientific production and understanding over time. It like feels like we should be able to talk. And I've tried, and I've been to meetings where the goal was to get us all in the room together to talk together about that. And still, you get this kind of slippage when people like us are confronted with. I love quantification. I mean, I'm on the scale of philosophers. I'm like one of the most quantified philosophers you can find. But then I get to that point, and I'm like, that might be too quantified. Like, maybe I have a limit that I didn't know I had. But it is. I mean, it is a very interesting kind of these moments when, and that was sort of what reading this stuff was. Exactly what reading this stuff was like, where you're like, wow, they are talking about exactly what I am talking about, and they're talking about it with a vocabulary that I've never seen before, and I'm really having to struggle to understand. That's a very fun. I mean, intellectually, it's a fun experience, even if it kind of breaks your brain.
But that's why I think that historiography is a way of a meeting point. Because then, if my readings of a particular period of time sort of make sense with their very quantifiable, you know, it's about building databases, then there's like, I can use their stuff, but not directly, sort of mediated by a historiographical sort of more sort of long history, or trying to put their subdiscipline in contact with my subdiscipline.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that.
Well, that's how.
I like that.
I have one more question. How does the this sort of, we should be sensitive to the form in which the article comes. How does that relate, or how did that play out in the taxonomy project?
Yeah, good. We pretend like the problem didn't exist. No, what I should, I mean, to be a little bit less glib, I guess another way to get around that problem is you can try to head it off entirely if you think your selection criteria for your data at the very beginning are limiting you to people who largely speak the same language and play the same game. And that was the approach in the taxonomy project, was to say, look, we're only going to take this very limited stretch of journals over a very limited time period, and now maybe we can just kind of grit our teeth and say, yeah, there are exceptions. There are things like errata and stuff that we've tried to filter out. But failing those like pretty statistically unimportant exceptions, we're just gonna assert that what remains is more or less the same kind of thing. The biggest place where I think that might have failed is in taxonomy. Very interesting distinction that one might draw between taxonomy of living forms and taxonomy, fossil taxonomy. Fossil people talk pretty differently for obvious reasons. They have a radically limited data set and method set. So we tried to pick journals that primarily talk about living stuff, but probably there's a decent amount of fossil description in there, and that's going to weird the data, or at least it might weird the data. I don't know yet to what extent it did.
And also perhaps there's a case to be made, I don't know, that the sociological characterization of the people who are doing taxonomy in the 19th century are quite similar to the people doing taxonomy now. There's a lot of amateurs, taxonomists.
True.
And so...
Also that corpus has a much smaller temporal scope.
Yeah.
So it bottoms out pretty hard in the mid-90s.
Okay.
So anything before about the mid-90s is pretty rare in that data set. There's a few things, there's a smattering of stuff, but that also helps. The social role of the people doing the work is more or less constant, I think.
Yeah,
that I actually am willing to say, unreservedly. But yeah, when it comes to these broader questions, or in this Ketley project, I mean, thinking about I really want to be able, in a number of different projects, to talk more cleverly about distribution and spread over time. And it seems to me that it's exactly there that these issues start to get really ugly. Once you want to tell a story about concept transmission and concept change and concept movement, because then you're explicitly saying you want to try to see ideas at work in the works of people who weren't the people who came up with them. It wasn't just the one community in which they were invented. And yeah, that's when it gets weird.
You mentioned scientometrics and how this is a different world, but at least the kind of classifications that you were talking about here seem to be super relevant to them too, right?
Yeah, true.
Whether something is a journal paper or errata or whatever, society management. I mean, that seems to be
true.
Very important, whatever techniques you use for them, just as well as for you, right? You should at least be interested in the results.
True, except that scientometrics itself tends to have, for obvious reasons, given the ends to which it's put, much more recency bias.
Sure.
But better than that, you're right. And an interesting challenge is, I mean, a bit, again, just like the linguistics question, but like how to convince yourself that you're making effective use of a literature that's not your own. You know, I really want to be able to say that I am making effective use of the scientometrics literature, but man, I know I'm not. And so, how to find my way around a foreign field has been tough as well. You need colleagues, you need interdisciplinary colleagues.
I had one tiny question about your classification thing.
Oh yeah.
Because we haven't had tiny questions this time. So, is it that bad that your classificator is not so good? Because the goal is not to sort of study society nodes. The goal is just to filter them out. And I was thinking, maybe it's just that it detects something weird, and this is why it all gets messed up. It's sort of like the attraction of long branches kind of thing. I don't know if it makes any sense regarding the algorithm. But
no, exactly, and I think, I mean, one thing that I really want to play with going forward as I try to refine that method to really work with it for real, something I need to do over the course of next year. You know, maybe exactly that. You know, maybe just a 2-class categorization system is even better. Right? Maybe the thing that the computer will have the easiest time dealing with is weird versus non-weird, and that. I mean, there's even reasons to think that like a priori reasons to think that might be kind of smart, right? That there is a kind of tone and a semantic or syntactic kind of orientation that you get in a real article, and if it's not there, then it's not that. Whatever it is that it is, isn't that. You'll also note, of course, I didn't, the article summary stuff, the kind of announcements of new discoveries stuff, that I still need to figure out how to pull on a little bit better, because I haven't really found a way to detect that stuff yet. But yeah, just to get the weird notes out. You're probably right, and that's something that's on my docket to fiddle with.
I also have a follow up on this. How does it play across sciences, and what kind of sciences are published? In this case, in Nature, because I was thinking like if you're interested in history of geography, you don't want to filter out geography notes or something like this.
Right. Early Nature is. Those disciplinary notes columns are really funny, by the way. They're very interesting. They start to aggregate like discoveries that people don't, or like little mentions of stuff that people don't even think merit an authorship, even at the time. Which is funny because at the time people thought almost anything merited an authorship. But it'll be these little things like in the astronomy notes too, for example, like this person saw this thing. And that's basically it, right? It's just like, oh yeah, we thought people might want to know that, this guy saw this thing. Very funny, yeah. Across, I mean, there is something very interesting about what this becomes a much bigger question as you go farther back. It's something that's Morgan spends a lot of time thinking about in the history work on the Journal des Savants. Is like, what sciences are we talking about over each of these time periods, and how does that change your understanding of what the journal is up to? And that is a really interesting question, and it's highly variable. You know, nature starts out with a pretty heavy life science and geography focus, and then moves into the physical sciences pretty quickly, and then kind of takes over everything else. But I mean, early on, there's a lot of natural history in there, and then that kind of recedes. How to deal with that, and whether that might also mess with various kinds of analyses. I guess it depends on what you want your analysis to do, but I haven't thought yet. It's also a very interesting question about what. That's probably another variable that you should sort of cross-tabulate with the rest, right? Trying to think about how disciplinary membership matters. Cool. Thanks. These were really good questions. This is really helpful. I'm diving back into writing this chapter now, so I really appreciate the thinking time. So.
Thanks.